really, over the course of his time, didn't see him with a lot of different young women. So with Carolyn, everybody was really interested because it just seemed like it.
She was breathtaking, untameable, and completely off limits. A glacial Manhattan goddess who bewitched the most hunted bachelor alive, then vanished without warning into a black summer ocean.
Everything okay?
Yeah. You should go back to your seat.
Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy was never just someone's wife. She was America's most glamorous secret, its most ruthlessly devoured obsession, and its most unforgivable tragedy. But behind that devastating, camera-ready facade, a raw, shocking story that nobody was ever meant to uncover. Until right now. The girl nobody knew she'd become. Let's start at the beginning, because Carolyn Bessette did not come from the world she would eventually conquer. Born on January 7th, 1966 in White Plains, New York, Carolyn was the daughter of Anne and William Bessette. Her parents divorced when she was 8 years old, and her mother later married Richard Freeman, an orthopedic surgeon, and moved to Old Greenwich, Connecticut. That move to Greenwich? That was everything. Greenwich wasn't just an address, it was a finishing school disguised as a zip code. Old money, country clubs, an expectation that you would carry yourself like you belonged, even if you didn't. And Carolyn, she learned fast. She attended St. Mary's High School in Greenwich, where she was voted by her classmates the ultimate beautiful person. She was athletic, warm, funny, and yes, strikingly beautiful. But here's what people always seem to miss about Carolyn. She was smart, strategically smart, socially intelligent in a way that can't be taught. After graduating from high school in 1984, she attended Boston University's School of Education, graduating in 1988 with a degree in elementary education. Not fashion, not communications. Elementary education. She had a genuine warmth for children and a nurturing side that rarely made it into the gossip columns. And that nurturing, quietly determined woman is the one that recent biographers and documentarians have been fighting to recover, because for too long, the real Carolyn was buried under the myth. But wait, how exactly does a girl from Greenwich end up becoming the most photographed woman in New York City? What happened in those years between Boston and the moment she walked into the crosshairs of the Kennedy dynasty?
It seemed like a storybook marriage. It's just, beneath the surface, every relationship is complicated.
The answer, like so much of Carolyn's life, is quieter than people expect. It wasn't a sudden transformation, it was a series of small, deliberate moves. After college, Carolyn didn't chase fame. She built a life. She worked modest jobs at first, including teaching, but eventually found her way into the world of fashion through Calvin Klein. And not at the top. She started at the bottom, learning the rhythms of an industry built on image, perception, and instinct. The rise, Calvin Klein and the making of an icon. From Boston, Carolyn Bessette made her way to Calvin Klein's New York offices. And honey, that wasn't luck, that was instinct. And this is where something clicked. At Calvin Klein, Carolyn wasn't just another employee. She became invaluable. She had an eye, a way of understanding people, of knowing what worked before anyone else could articulate it. Clients trusted her. Designers noticed her. She moved up, not because she demanded attention, but because she earned it in quiet, undeniable ways. There was a confidence in her that didn't need to announce itself. She also began refining something else, her personal style. Clean lines, minimalism, effortless elegance that looked simple but was anything but. It wasn't about trends, it was about control, about knowing exactly who you were and presenting it without apology. By the time John F. Kennedy Jr. met her, Carolyn had already become someone. Not publicly, but internally. She had built a version of herself that was strong, composed, and self-contained. And maybe that's the part people didn't see. Because when the world finally noticed her, it assumed she had just arrived. But Carolyn had been becoming herself for years, quietly, intentionally, and entirely on her own terms. She started in sales and quickly ascended through the ranks. While working for Klein in Boston, she was noticed by a traveling sales coordinator who recommended her to Susan Sokol, president of Calvin Klein Collection. Sokol, impressed with Bessette's grace and style, named her to a position dealing with Klein's high-profile clients, including actress Annette Bening and newscaster Diane Sawyer. She eventually became director of publicity for the company's flagship Manhattan store. At Calvin Klein in the early 90s, her job was to manage the chaos surrounding one of fashion's most volatile and glamorous brands. She dressed celebrities, she navigated egos, she sat front row at shows, and she was extraordinary at it. She had what the fashion world calls a presence. The kind you can't manufacture. But here's the tea nobody pours enough. Carolyn wasn't just a pretty face doing grunt work. She had taste. Impeccable, almost frightening taste. The minimalist aesthetic she championed personally, the slip dresses, the clean lines, the radical restraint, became arguably the defining look of the 1990s, and she was living it before anyone even named it. Elizabeth Beller, who wrote the 2024 biography Once Upon a Time, The Captivating Life of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, has said she felt Carolyn had been misrepresented by misogynistic tabloid media and wanted to place her life and choices in proper context. And she's right, because even at the height of her Calvin Klein years, Carolyn was being reduced, flattened, made into a supporting character in everyone else's story. She was not a supporting character, she was the whole show. And then John F. Kennedy Jr. walked in. Now, here is where the story gets delicious and complicated, because their love story was never the fairy tale the tabloids wanted you to believe it was. So what was it really? John and Carolyn, the truth behind the romance. Carolyn Bessette first met John F. Kennedy Jr. in 1992, while he was still dating actress Daryl Hannah. She and Kennedy began dating seriously in 1994 and quickly became a popular paparazzi target, with gossip columns detailing where they ate, shopped, and even documenting their public disagreements. From the outside, it looked like destiny in a Gap ad. John F. Kennedy Jr., the sexiest man alive, son of Camelot, heir to the most mythologized family in American history, and Carolyn, the serene, luminous woman who seemed custom ordered from a universe that only produces beautiful people. But behind closed doors, it was messy. Paparazzi regularly waited outside the couple's Tribeca apartment to photograph them. A video emerged of the couple in an explosive argument in a Manhattan park, raw, human, and publicly consumed like entertainment. That video said something the magazines never would. This relationship was passionate, volatile, and under tremendous external pressure from day one. And yet, they committed. Kennedy and Bessette were married on September 21st, 1996 in a deliberately secret ceremony. No press, no circus, just family, close friends, a small church, and candlelight on Cumberland Island, Georgia, a remote barrier island with no road access.
We're married in a secret ceremony hidden away from the eyes of the world.
Carolyn wore a bias-cut pearl gray silk gown designed by Narciso Rodriguez, a then unknown designer, and triggered a global fashion moment that reverberated for years. The dress was everything. Simple, architectural, bridal without being bridal. It is still considered one of the most influential wedding gowns of the 20th century. But even in that beautiful, secret moment, the trap was being set. Because once the photos leaked, once the world saw Carolyn Bessette as Mrs. Kennedy, she stopped being a person and became a projection screen. And here's where the real story, the one that recent biographers are finally telling, gets dark. So what happened when Carolyn stepped into the full force of the Kennedy spotlight? Because what the public saw and what was actually happening inside that marriage were two very different things. The Gilded Cage, life as a Kennedy. Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy gave up her career at Calvin Klein after the marriage. And that, if you're paying attention, is the first quiet tragedy in this story. Here was a woman who had built herself from Greenwich to Boston to the highest levels of the New York fashion world through her own intelligence, taste, and effort. And now, because of who her husband was, she couldn't really work. She couldn't walk down the street without a lens trained on her face. She told her friend, Carol Radziwill, that the only way to avoid the paparazzi was to leave her apartment at 7 in the morning. She also complained to her friend, journalist Jonathan Soroff, that she could not get a job without being accused of exploiting her fame. She became, essentially, a prisoner of her own marriage. Steve Gillen, a historian and close friend of John's, has noted that he grew up with paparazzi. It was second nature to him, whereas Carolyn struggled mightily with the amount of attention and the focus on celebrity. It was a source of real tension within their marriage. Bessette-Kennedy refused to give interviews and turned down offers to appear in fashion magazines. She tried desperately to hold onto a private self, but the press was relentless, and we need to say this clearly. The media coverage of Carolyn was not just intense, it was invasive and cruel in ways that today we might recognize more readily as misogynistic. Her weight became tabloid fodder. When she lost weight, she was anorexic. When she looked pale, she was on drugs. When she smiled, she was cold. When she didn't, she was unstable. She could not win. Even now, there's something haunting about how quickly admiration turned into intrusion. One minute, she was setting the tone for an entire decade of style. The next, she was dodging cameras just to breathe. It makes you wonder if the world ever really loved her, or if it just loved the idea of watching her unravel in real time. Even Eunice Kennedy Shriver later rejected the idea that any of it was destiny, saying that the real curse her family faced was the tabloid talk and the lack of privacy they were afforded during their most difficult moments. That observation lands differently when you think about Carolyn, a woman who wasn't even born a Kennedy, who married into a hurricane and was given no shelter from it whatsoever. She was 33 years old. She had not yet figured out who she was going to be inside all of this. She was still becoming. And then time ran out. So how did it all end? Because the night of July 16th, 1999 is one of those moments in American history that people remember exactly where they were. But do you know what was actually supposed to happen that evening? And what chain of small decisions led to disaster? The night everything ended. July 16th, 1999, a Friday evening in summer. John F. Kennedy Jr. was piloting his single-engine Piper Saratoga 2HP from Essex County Airport in New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. With him were Carolyn and her sister Carolyn Bessette, who was catching a connecting flight to a vacation. The plan was simple. The night was not. John was not an experienced instrument pilot. He was rated to fly visually, meaning he relied on being able to see the horizon. That evening, there was a significant haze over the water. The sky and the ocean blurred into one gray murk. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation found that Kennedy became disoriented because of haze and darkness.
We begin tonight with breaking news. John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane has been reported missing off the coast of Massachusetts.
The official cause was pilot error. Without visual reference to the horizon, a pilot can begin to descend without realizing it, because the body's inner ear lies. The plane feels level. The instruments say otherwise. And if you're not trained to trust the instruments over your body, you follow your gut. And your gut kills you. At approximately 9:41 p.m., the plane crashed into the Atlantic. There were no distress calls. The search began almost immediately after the plane failed to arrive, but it took 5 days, 5 agonizing, publicly broadcast days, before the wreckage and the bodies were recovered from the ocean floor. Kennedy was 38 at the time of his death. Carolyn was 33, Lauren was 34. They were buried at sea on July 22nd, 1999, from a naval vessel, a privilege afforded by the Kennedy family's singular place in American life. Their ashes were scattered over the Atlantic, near the area where they had gone into the water. But here's what the obituaries left out. The question that haunts people even now, a quarter century later. Was Carolyn even supposed to be on that plane? And why exactly did John choose to fly without the safety net he'd been relying on? The questions that linger. The flight that night carried an additional weight of small, terrible decisions. John had broken his ankle in a paragliding accident months earlier and was still recovering. A detail that aviation analysts have noted quietly, given that operating rudder pedals requires precise footwork. He also chose to fly that evening without a flight instructor in the co-pilot seat, despite having relied on one during his training. Questions were raised in the wake of the accident about whether Kennedy's relative inexperience as a pilot played a role in the crash. Not just inexperience, but a specific compounding set of circumstances that, individually, might have been manageable, but together became fatal. And then there is the matter of Carolyn herself. Multiple accounts suggest she had been nervous about flying with John before. She was a woman who had already spent 3 years fighting for scraps of privacy and normalcy. She was a woman in a complicated marriage under an extraordinary amount of pressure, trying to figure out her next chapter. She got in the plane anyway. What would Carolyn's life have looked like if she hadn't? That is the question that lingers. Because by all accounts, from friends, from the biographers now doing the serious work of reconstructing her story, she was more than the tragedy. She was on the edge of something. Maybe a career pivot, maybe a new kind of independence. Maybe just the slower, quieter piece of a woman who had survived 3 brutal years in the world's fishbowl and was finally starting to find her footing. We'll never know. And what about the world Carolyn left behind? Because here's where something important has shifted. Something the tabloids that tormented her in life would never have predicted. In the years since her death, the narrative has quietly rewritten itself. The same culture that once reduced her to headlines and speculation has, in a strange reversal, begun to search for who she really was beneath it all. Not just the wife of a Kennedy, not just a reluctant public figure, but a woman with taste, restraint, and a kind of quiet defiance that didn't always translate in a world addicted to noise. The scrutiny that once suffocated her has been replaced by a kind of distance, one that allows people to look back with more care than curiosity. There is something haunting about that shift. It raises an uncomfortable truth about how often people are only fully seen once they are gone. Carolyn's story, in that sense, becomes less about the circumstances of her death and more about the cost of how she was forced to live. The constant attention, the speculation, the pressure to perform a role she never asked for, it all left its mark long before that final flight. And so the questions linger not just about what happened that night, but about everything that led up to it. About choices, yes, but also about environments, expectations, and the invisible weight carried by those who live under a spotlight they never sought. In the end, the tragedy isn't only in what was lost in a single moment, but in how much of her life was shaped by forces she could never fully escape. The legacy, what the world is finally getting right. Here's the most maddening part of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy's story. She is more famous in death than she ever allowed herself to be in life. And in death, she has become something even more powerful, a corrective. Her death, alongside John's, added a new chapter to one of the most enduring myths in American popular culture, the so-called Kennedy curse. The Kennedy curse refers to a series of deaths, accidents, assassinations, and other calamities involving members of the Kennedy family, primarily the descendants of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., including political assassinations, plane crashes, and sudden deaths across multiple generations. It is a list that, laid out in full, feels cosmic, like a family marked. But here's what serious people have been saying for years. Skeptics argue that it is not improbable for a large, extended, high-profile family to experience similar events over the course of several generations. Some historians argue that the public's fascination with the family's misfortunes magnified the perception of a pattern, and that media coverage of each accident and loss contributed to a mythology that transcended factual reporting. The Kennedy curse is a narrative. It's a frame. It's what happens when grief gets packaged for consumption across decades of tabloid coverage. Calling it a curse lets everyone off the hook. The recklessness, the circumstances, the very human chain of decisions that led to each disaster, and transforms it into something fatalistic, something nobody could have stopped. Carolyn deserves better than to be reduced to a data point in someone else's mythology. And increasingly, finally, the culture is starting to agree. In 2024, Elizabeth Beller published Once Upon a Time, The Captivating Life of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, which became a New York Times bestseller and is the biography that directly inspired the 2026 FX series Love Story, John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette. Beller has said she wrote the book because she felt Carolyn had been misrepresented by a misogynistic tabloid media and wanted to place her life and choices in proper context. In 2025, CNN premiered American Prince, JFK Jr., a 3-part documentary series featuring interviews with close friends and family, including Carol Radziwill, Robert De Niro, and Cindy Crawford, examining celebrity, privacy, and legacy. Notably, the conversation in that film kept returning not just to John, but to what was done to Carolyn, the particular cruelty of being a private person thrust into the most public family in America. The FX series Love Story premiered in February 2026 and accumulated more than 25 million hours of viewing across Hulu and Disney Plus for its first 5 episodes, the highest streaming total for a limited series in FX's history. The cultural appetite for Carolyn's story, told properly, has proven to be enormous. And her fashion legacy? Untouchable. The slip dresses, the perfectly tailored blazers, the low bun, those dark sunglasses that said, "Don't even try." A generation of women who weren't born when she died have claimed her as a reference point and an icon, proof that her instincts were not just good, they were ahead of their time. But here is the tragedy inside the legacy. Carolyn never got to define herself on her own terms. She never wrote the memoir, never gave the interview she deserved to give. The fact that she never spoke to the media or gave interviews made her a mysterious figure to many. But her former colleagues have been clear that this was not coldness, it was self-preservation. By every account from people who actually knew her, the real Carolyn was funnier, warmer, sharper, and more interesting than the frozen icon the world chose to preserve. She swore like a sailor with close friends. She had a wicked sense of humor. She was deeply loyal. She cried at the movies. Carolyn was still, at 33, a young woman in the middle of becoming. She was denied the rest of the story. Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy lived for 33 years. In that time, she was packaged into a curse that wasn't real, defined by a marriage that was only part of her story, and frozen at 33 in an image she never chose for herself. The tabloids that tormented her in life tried to own her in death too, turning her into a ghost story, a cautionary tale, an accessory to someone else's myth. But something is shifting. The biographies, the documentaries, the conversations happening right now, they are all pointing at the same woman. Not the icon, not the wife, not the victim. Just Carolyn. Funny, fierce, private, brilliant, still becoming. And maybe that is a real legacy, that it took the world 25 years to slow down, stop projecting, and finally ask, who was she, actually? The answer is more interesting than the myth ever was. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe because we're just getting started. Drop in the comments, do you think the world ever truly saw Carolyn for who she really was? And share this with someone who needs to hear the full story.